Hi everyone, and welcome back to my Consultants Explorer channel. I'm Charlie, and I'm here to help you explore the early career years of management consulting, help you to be successful at it, and show you how to make the most of the opportunities that it opens up for you. I spent 8.5 years at Accenture, building the most incredible launchpad for my own career. And now that I'm running my own businesses, I can choose what I work on whenever and wherever I want to in the world. And that is the kind of freedom that I can help you find in your journey, which starts just as mine did in management consulting. So given I spent 10 years in corporate management consulting and have spent the last 4 years working with, for, and at startups, I figured there's so much I can tell you with hindsight now about the differences between the two, and about the things which you learn in consulting that will set you up best for when you join or start a startup. And if you know these things now, you can capitalize on them while you're in consulting, learn them faster than I did, and accelerate your readiness for the next stage of your career in the world of startups, rather than only knowing in hindsight what was important. The main takeaway I have for you today is having a foundation in consulting will prepare you like nothing else can for when you go on to enter the world of startups. People do it both ways. I have friends who went straight into starting or joining a startup after uni, and they've learned things the startup way. They also learn things specific to startups that you have to learn quickly if you join the startup world from consulting, although there are lots of books you can read in parallel to help with this. But the key thing here is learning things the consulting way first gives you a very important edge. You'll have direct insight into how the C-suite run big business in a way that will prepare you to grow a startup into a big business with much more nous and confidence. You'll have methodologies up your sleeve for understanding and solving problems, regardless of their shape or size, which will mean you're not easily thrown off track in your startup. You'll know how to design and run a plan to meet objectives on time and on budget, including knowing how to deal with risks, build in contingency, and effectively replan where required, in a way that will mean that you can work with a startup investment budget to deliver what you're supposed to for that investment, earning and maintaining the confidence of your investors. You'll know how to motivate, inspire, and ultimately how to lead a team, as well as how to interview people and determine suitability for roles, all of which is important as a leader in a startup. You'll understand the politics of the business world well in advance of having to navigate it from a sales perspective as a fresh-faced startup. You'll know the types of skills and the phases of project required to deliver new technology, which is a core focus for a tech startup founder. You'll know how to present your ideas, deliver your messages, and influence the right people to push forward something you're passionate about, which couldn't be more important when you're looking to convince people of the value of your startup product for investment or sales or recruitment or any other purpose. You'll know the value of hard work, but you'll also have learned work-life balance in a way that means that you can produce consistent output continuously without burning out, meaning you can weather the ups and downs of startup land, push through, and ultimately find success. In summary, a foundation in corporate consulting means you'll have the opportunity to have developed a professional maturity well beyond your years, and that professional maturity can be used to accelerate your progress in the startup world ahead of your peers. So we're going to step through the differences between corporate consulting and startup land. And for each difference, consider how having consulting experience gives you an edge. This is part 2 of 2 parts, and I'm going to cover 3 categories of differences: work stuff, senior management, and hierarchy. In part 1, I covered the first 3 categories of differences: culture, speed, and types of teams. So if you haven't watched that part, then I do recommend you start there, as part 2 builds on some of the context I set there. Here's the link to part 1, and don't worry, you'll be able to link back to this part 2 from there. So let's start with work stuff, our 4th category of differences. First, let's talk about presentations or slide decks, PowerPoint slides, Google slides, all of the above. If there's one thing that consulting companies will ever give up, it's not this. Creating presentations is the bread and butter of the job, and as a consultant, you'll learn to create them in a way that is much more powerful, much more engaging, and much more influential than in many other careers. Leaders in consulting often pride themselves on their presentations, and in all honesty, they can be really quite picky about what their slides look like, what information they present, and how. But it's because it matters, because the audience of your presentation will jump on board with you if they're swayed by your presentation. This means that most slide decks produced by consultants, especially the ones for sales or senior client conversations, are given a great deal of scrutiny. Storylines are carefully crafted, visuals are diligently designed, and client branding is prominent. Each presentation deck becomes a little masterpiece in its own right. On the other hand, in startup world, slides undergo much less scrutiny. Often there is no logical storyline, there are no visuals, and branding is relevant to the startup rather than its customers. In part, this is due to the nature of startups. There is less time to create something as much more happens ad hoc or last minute. But also there is just less focus on influencing people with slides, because startups are more a product business than a people business. And this scenario self-perpetuates. People working at startups don't often see masterfully created slides, and so they don't get the opportunity to learn to produce them either. So your experience in slide creation during your time in consulting is invaluable to startups. Once you've created enough high-quality slide decks, you get pretty good at creating that level of quality rapidly and repeatedly. Your ability to structure your deck, to land key messages within a storyline, and maintain audience attention with engaging visuals is an important asset to both early-stage startups and scale-ups who need to present convincing arguments to investors, to customers, to partners, and to potential new recruits, all on a very regular basis. Relatedly, let's talk about structure. Structure is important to consultants for a few reasons. It drives effectiveness because it helps to determine chronological order of work required to produce the outputs. It creates efficiency by aligning team members on their roles and responsibilities, which is important when your client is paying for a limited number of people over a limited amount of time to deliver specific output. And it creates scalability because it highlights sections that are repeatable, which is important for delivering a high quantity of output. Consultants run projects successfully because they create structure. They use problem-solving methodologies, project plans, decision and escalation procedures, and reporting metrics. More or less everything is structured: teams, work, and even career paths. Employees' ambitions are funneled into expertly tuned performance evaluation engines that motivate everyone to keep working towards the next career level. By contrast, startups are necessarily unstructured. Creating overly formalized structure too soon in a young startup can prevent it from pivoting the way that it needs to be successful. Early-stage startups often thrive on lack of static structure because it means it's possible to capitalize on any unexpected opportunities that might present themselves, whether it's the opportunity to enter a new market, or give someone new responsibility, or change the target customer. But actually, structure is also important in early-stage startups. Being able to create a structure to map out the best way to progress your next phase of work is still important, even if next month you'll create a new structure to complete the phase after that. And being able to create structures that help your startup team work effectively together and progress in their own careers are also important, even if you create a new structure next week that works even better. So revisitable agile structure is what works in startups, which means that to be successful in startups, you actually end up creating more structures more frequently than you even do in consulting. And this isn't just true of early stage startups. When a startup hits a certain size as it scales, or when it hits a certain maturity of product and revenue, too much flexibility and lack of formalized structure very often hinders its success. People become more and more confused and ultimately unproductive if they aren't all clear on what everyone else is doing and why, and how it fits with what they're doing. And without a level of structure around people's career paths, employees will search for opportunities elsewhere that give them more obvious progression prospects. So it's important to be able to define and implement structure in scale-ups too. So you get the sense of how your experience with structuring teams and work and career paths in consulting can help you be really successful in the world of startups too, no matter the size of startup. So lastly in this category, let's consider the horizon of your work. And by this I mean how far ahead you know what it is that you're going to be working on. From what we covered just now on structure, it's pretty evident that working in a startup can mean that you don't know from 1 month to the next what you might be working on. Your horizons are very short term. Things change very quickly, and you need to be able to adapt to new expectations and objectives accordingly. Working in consulting, on the other hand, you might be on a project for 6 months to a year, which gives you a much longer term horizon where you could have a pretty good sense of the work you'll be doing over that future time period. You might be able to do things like plan out your work life balance accordingly. For example, choosing in advance when might be best to take a holiday based on how your responsibilities are going to play out. But actually, this level of certainty isn't always the case. In fact, it's usually better to assume that it's never the case. I've seen consulting projects significantly change direction multiple times. I've seen them cancelled at short notice. I've seen clients reapportion responsibilities from one consultancy to another mid-project with very little warning. Literally everything is possible. You might be staffed into a 12-month project role, only to find out next month that you're going to be doing something entirely different, and you'll even be based in a different country. But there are also projects which do play out as intended, where you do get to see your long-term horizons and plan accordingly. So your experience in consulting will help you learn to operate with any distance of horizon, short or long, or somewhere in the middle, which when you start or join a startup, which progresses into scale-up territory and beyond, will be useful for you personally in always setting appropriate expectations, not just for yourself, but for those in your work life, like your direct reports, and also your personal life too, who might be affected by your plans. Okay, on to our fifth category, which is senior management. Interestingly, the management teams of scale-ups are often ex-corporate senior leaders who know how to grow and run an enterprise-sized business, including some very senior leaders from consulting. But often it's not those people who start those startups or develop them to scale-up stage. Although not always, it is often younger entrepreneurs who take on the risk of founding startups and leading them towards profitability. And the founders that do this successfully, bringing their startup to scale-up stage, often then experience quite a profound fear of being replaced by a corporate CEO chosen by their board. There are some really interesting books out there on the types of CEO required by different stages of company. For example, the difference between wartime and peacetime CEOs, highlighted in Ben Horowitz's Hard Thing About Hard Things. But in the scenario where a startup scales up, boards generally want to ensure that their CEO is someone who knows how enterprise-level business operates, so that they can be confident that the CEO will be able to run the company at that size. That type of CEO is usually a very different type of person with very different experience to the kind of CEO who is great at starting a company from scratch. But here's the thing. Experience in consulting is, in my opinion, the best experience you can have for preparing you for both stages of a startup's life cycle. As a corporate consultant, you work with enterprise-sized client businesses every day. So you're well integrated into those ways of working, especially at the senior levels. But you also work with much smaller startup technology vendors whose ways of working you have to navigate and adopt. In addition to that, you've experienced lots of the aspects of an early startup environment in your work too, with unpredictability of project work, constant streams of new colleague faces, and people management that is also disconnected from age. And on top of that, you learn the tools that are critical to be successful in an early stage startup, like the ability to create structure, to manage expectations, and to find and interpret information. If any of those things don't sound super familiar yet, then it might be because you haven't listened to part one, in which case, here's the link if you need it. But in summary, your consulting experience is a great foundation for a CEO journey, from startup to scale up to enterprise. Okay, time for our sixth and final category, hierarchy. Whilst corporate consulting is much flatter than it is hierarchical, I'd still say it's much more hierarchical than most startups. Senior consulting leaders are generally very accessible personally, even to junior consultants. The hierarchy plays out pretty strongly when it comes to who is responsible for what work. The more junior you are, the more of the detail you own. The more senior you are, the less of the actual slide or Excel output you create, and the more client relationships you nurture. Seniority plays into the meetings you attend and the events you're invited to as well. As a consultant, you learn your place in terms of the work that you should do and the privileges you're afforded. In startups, by contrast, there's typically much more of an all-hands-on-deck culture. Because responsibilities aren't so well defined and apportioned, and because work priorities vary so rapidly, people who run and work in startups generally get pulled into working alongside people of all seniorities. There's much less hierarchy in the work you do and the privileges you're afforded than there is in consulting. But there is also a key way in which consulting teaches you to thrive in this startup environment. As a junior consultant, if you're hungry for more responsibility and privileges, you learn very quickly that the more you take charge by really owning your own work and really driving your own agenda in extracurriculars, the faster you progress. That means you learn to both create and seize opportunities as soon as you can. You dive in where you see potential, and you earn the respect and credibility of your colleagues. And crucially, you do this at a very early stage in your career. And that is the exact same way that you thrive in the startup environment, in which it's all hands on deck. The more you take charge, own things, pick up additional responsibilities, and produce brilliant output, the more successful you will be. The faster you'll be considered part of the senior team. Clearly, a startup founder or CEO needs to do all these things as a prerequisite of their role anyway. But as an employee doing these things, it can stand you out dramatically from your peers and accelerate your career accordingly. So those are our final three categories. And I hope that by now you're excited by the prospects that consulting will give you if you take your consulting experience into startup world, either in running your own startup or in joining one. In these three categories, we've seen how consulting gives you an edge over your peers by teaching you to create powerful slides, to define structure, to work with both predictability and unpredictability, and always set expectations appropriately, to retain your CEO position as your early stage startup makes it to enterprise scale, and really to take charge of your own career progression by creating and seizing opportunities wherever you can. If you're excited by the opportunity ahead of you now, then let me know by clicking the like button. And if you'd like to see what I post next, then definitely subscribe to my channel. Social media links are below if you'd like updates via those. And if you have any questions, then feel free to use the comment section here and I will do my best to answer absolutely everything. In the meantime, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great day and I wish you all the best with your exploring.